Welcome everyone to this ShowMe50 Lean In Circle, where we're going to cover a hot topic on sustainability and ESG. And I hope that you'll leave here not only understanding a little bit more about ESG and sustainability, but really understanding the why behind why you might find it compelling to you, both in the work that you do in helping your organizations advance sustainability goals, but also from your own personal passions around what parts of ESG really talk to you. So we're going to talk a lot about the why. So welcome everyone. I'm going to kick it off. I know I see a lot of new faces. Tell you just a little bit about ShowMe50. We are a lean in regional network leader, and that enables us to collaborate with Lean In to bring content that helps enhance women's skills and confidence. And then ShowMe50 provides content regarding enhancing company policies and practices to really influence more inclusive workplaces. And so together that is powerful, and that's how we can get to 50% women leading. We provide numerous types of content. You can see here a quick flash on these. Basically, it's about gender bias, reducing inequities, leveling the playing field at work, and providing inclusive leadership training programs. So today what we're going to cover is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my why. We're going to do a little time travel for you to really understand the why behind ESG and help you remember some important points about ESG. We're going to play a matching game, again, to help reinforce what you're learning and make it fun. We're going to drill into the details of ESG. And I'm going to wrap it up with showing you what I call a diagram of purpose around ESG and sustainability. And please pay attention, because we'll do a quick recap quiz at the end, again, in the hopes that you're able to really retain some of this information. So let me tell you a little bit about my why. Why am I in this area? Why does it speak to me? As a Hispanic female with over 30 years working in corporations, I've experienced a lot. And so that really drove me to start ShowMe50 and participate in all this programming. And if you think about what's involved in this area that's my passion, gender equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, equal access to opportunity, reduced inequalities, think about that under the umbrella of social responsibility. Social responsibility. And by the way, please do use the chat if you have questions and comments. I'll be checking the chat periodically. And I see Suzanne out there on the call. So Suzanne, who is one of our leaders in our Circle network, reach out to me and call out if someone has some questions we want to cover. Thanks a lot, Suzanne. Okay, so social responsibility. Well, social starts with an S, and that is one component of ESG. So let's do a little time travel for you to understand the why behind ESG. It all started in the 70s. And you know what? I worked on an assignment in investor relations in the middle part of my career. And that's really when I began to learn about ESG, because investors care about ESG. And it all goes back to the 70s and the Vietnam War. In the images on the screen, you'll be able to see how I relate this and communicate it. So the Vietnam War, there's a lot of protesting, and that starts something called socially responsible investing. Religious and civil rights organizations really compelled people to care about where their companies were working and how they were working. Who you invested in mattered. In fact, at the time, South Africa had apartheid going on, and there was a lot of activism to help institutions protest apartheid and eliminate it. So that was really some of the early catalysts. In the 80s, a lot of that protests and activism against apartheid translated into legislation, right? We tried to turn it into public policy. Also, in the lower picture, you can see an image of carbon emissions. You know, there was a lot going on at the time. You may have read about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. There was big fossil fuel debates. Environmental issues really came to the forefront, and investors who annually vote on the proxy statements became much more vocal. So again, there was just a lot of activism and shareholder involvement in this case, environment. The National Meteorological Association, or World Meteorological Association, boy, that's hard to say, began to work with the United Nations, and they established something called the IPCC. And that stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they began to really talk a lot about the impact to the climate from things like fossil fuel and production of oil and gas. Moving into the 90s, you now have the internet. Again, investors begin to create index funds that are tied to good and bad companies. So you have something called selection criteria. So not only were they using financial criteria, but social environmental criteria in creating these funds. So the Domini 400 was one of the first index funds that looked at companies who did not do the bad things. For example, let's say manufacturing cigarettes, but did want to do more of the good things like providing healthcare. And so mutual funds like that began to be included in ESG investing considerations. You also had more climate information coming to the forefront. You had the UN Earth Summit that in fact led to the Kyoto Protocol, where we defined the greenhouse gases that were really causing more global warming. Does anybody have any questions so far on the few slides we've covered? Greenhouse gases, let's do something in the chat. Does anybody name some of the greenhouse gases that climate science is now well documented warms the earth? Does anybody know? Yep, CO2. Thank you, Suzanne. Anybody else want to try a stab? Methane. And by the way, methane is 28 times more damaging to climate change and the warming of the earth than CO2. But there's a lot less of it, right? We drive a lot of cars more than the methane. Yep, CH4, thank you. So this audience knows a lot already about greenhouse gases. Yep, nitrous oxide. Okay, so then moving on into the 2000s, what was happening then? The United Nations formed the Global Compact. The Global Compact was a way to try to get businesses to really get into the conversation around these concepts of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And so the Global Compact asked companies to sign up for being in support of human rights, labor standards, environmental issues, and anti-corruption. So that really started with business. The GRI, does anybody know what that stands for? Global Reporting Initiative came into being. This was some standards, so how companies could report on the many parts of sustainability and ESG. The Principles for Responsible Investing was formed, and you also began to see a lot more growth in what's called impact investing. In the 2010s, you had more standardization. An organization called SASB was formed, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. You had the Paris Agreement in 2015, which, to date, there's about, 190 countries, 192, what they call not necessarily only countries, but parties. For example, the EU is part of the Paris Agreement, but the EU is not a single country, it's a party. The Sustainable Development Goals were published by the United Nations. Those are the 17 colorful squares you see on the screen. And then lastly, in 2019, Larry Fink, who is the chair of BlackRock, of giant institutional management company, came out with what the statement of a corporation is. And, when I went to school, I learned that the purpose of a corporation was to make as much money as you could for shareholders, for investors. But really companies have recognized that if companies can take care of all their stakeholders, not only the shareholders, then everyone wins and the company achieves more growth and more profits that benefit everyone. So that was a big shift, a big turning point when that statement came out. And Larry Fink and the Business Roundtable, which is a group of America's largest companies, their CEOs, they continue to speak about the importance of stakeholder engagement. Okay, so then you get into the 2020s, where we are today. We started out the decade in the Great Recession. We've had a lot of social unrest. Equity and justice is at the forefront. The picture at the bottom shows you, it's meant to display people who want a voice at the table, specifically in front of the boardroom, in front of the boards of these giant corporations. They want a voice, and so there's greater scrutiny being placed on boards. In fact, last year, a small shareholder put a proposal together for Exxon and actually was able to replace several board members who were not active enough in thinking about the transition and the risk for Exxon of not dealing with the energy transition in a more efficient way. So this was kind of the 20s and kind of where we are today. The far right box that says the growth is really referring to the increasing amount of money that is going into ESG investment funds, right? So more money is coming in as investors are more and more concerned. And in fact, just today, does anybody know what just happened? Something big happened with the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning. I just came from listening to the call on it. Does anybody know what happened today? And it's going to be all over the news. The Securities and Exchange Commission is proposing that publicly traded companies will now have to include the greenhouse gas emissions into their 10Ks, their annual filing requirements. And yes, Annie, the proposed rule was released today. Again, there was a press release and a long conference call, and I attended it, and it's amazing. So scope 1 and scope 2 are definitely going to be required. Also, they will have to be attested. Scope 3 will be required for any companies who have stated in their goals that they include scope 3. Also, there's this awesome part that the companies are going to have to relate back to the line items in their financial reports from where the GHGs are coming from. Lastly, I thought was very awesome is that companies will be required to state the methodology that they're using to compute the financial implications from the greenhouse gases, right? There's both risk and opportunities from greenhouse gas emissions. And so companies will have to explain their methodologies. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what I just covered. And I'm not seeing much action here in the chat. So if anybody has any questions or comments, please do let me know. We can stop and answer questions. But here's what we covered. The 70s were a catalyst for ESG, and really it all started with the Vietnam War and activism against the war, and companies really wanting to have a say in what was happening. In the 80s, we're starting to legislate social responsibility. In the 90s, we have a global call to action. The 2000s is about education and more standards coming out. Again, in the 2010s, things are amplifying with regard to standardization. You have BlackRock that came out with the purpose of a corporation being not just, profits for the shareholders, but for value for all the stakeholders. And of course, where we are today, we've got social unrest and more activism. So we've sort of come full circle. So there you have the whys of ESG. I think it's important for you to understand why this all started. It's not something that just happened. This has been going on since the 70s. So let's talk about how much you may already know. I know you know a lot because people already knew all the greenhouse gases. So that's awesome. We're going to do this little exercise. I'm going to use the polling functionality here to cover what are the details within environmental, social, and governance. So what we're going to do is I'm showing you some images, some icons that represent environmental, social, and governance. And I'm going to turn the poll feature on here, and we are going to launch a poll. So what I want you to do is look at the icon group number 3 and tell me which one of the ES or G that you think that goes to. So we're looking at icon group number 3. And which one do you think it goes to? Is it the E, the S, or the G? We'll wait a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and let's see, which one does number 3 go to? And I will share the results, and hopefully you can see that it goes with environmental. So now, come on, that was kind of an easy one. You got the recycling, the electric car, and the earth, right? So that gave it away. Okay, so let's do another one. There's only 2 left. So what I want you to think about is icon group number 1. Which one does that go with? So here's the poll. Icon group number 1. Look at those little pictures. Which do you think it belongs to? S or G? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And you guys did awesome. It goes with the G. Okay, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the details of each one of these. So hopefully we can have more conversation here in our remaining time together. I'd love to answer your questions and really get your comments and thoughts about the components within each element. So let's start out with environmental. So, environmental is the most straightforward: air and water pollution, carbon emission reduction, energy efficiency, waste reduction, water conservation, and biodiversity. So I'd love to hear from you guys. Questions? Do you have questions about the elements that make up the E? Does anybody know what it means by CO2E? CO2E. What's the E?
CO2 equivalent, so that brings in like methane gases or other things like that.
Yes. Who was that? It's hard for me to tell on the
Maddie, hi.
Hey Maddie, thanks so much. Yep, you're right on. As I mentioned earlier, of those 7 methane gases, not all of them impact the warming of the planet by equal amounts. So the largest one in volume is carbon dioxide, but other gases are more bad. Like methane is 28 times as bad as carbon. There's just not as much of it. So what the E does is when you report on your greenhouse gases, you convert everything into like impact on the environment so that you can look at it equally. So CO2 equivalents. How about another one that's not talked about as much, but will be in the future, is biodiversity. Have you all heard of biodiversity and kind of what that means? Does anybody want to take a stab at how you interpret biodiversity? When you think about all of the ecosystems on the planet, there's we talk about diversity at work, right? Well, there's a lot of diversity in the species and the characteristics of everything that is on the earth. And when we start to mess with Mother Nature and get it out of its balance, we begin to impact other species and other parts of the environment. So it's important to make sure we maintain the balance. A simple example would be thinking about trees. And when you cut down trees, you're changing the balance of the species that used to live and operate in that area. And so trees is one thing, animals is another thing. You know, as you eliminate things from their natural state, you're really changing the dynamic of how everything works. Okay, let's look at the social aspects. This one, as you can see, is kind of like my passion area: gender equity, diversity, labor standards. You know, when you talk about labor standards, and this goes back to, I mentioned about the United Nations Global Compact, and one of the items in the compact is about labor standards. And really it's about enabling people to form and really advocate for improvement in labors in the places where they work. Oh, somebody, Claude Jose just wrote something in there, I missed it. Not only removing, but also adding new species, right? Pluses and minuses, right? It changes the dynamic when you add a new species that wasn't in that environment before because of human intervention that caused new species to go to places that weren't really prepared for that. The third bullet under social doesn't get talked about much either and is important: customer protection and product responsibility. We want to make sure when it comes to people that we're protecting them and putting out products that don't hurt people. So that's that one. Human rights, and then human capital management. I want to mention one other thing as we brought the word capital came here. Another way to think about environmental, social, and governance is in terms of capital. So environmental is about natural capital, right? And the assets in the world that are nature's assets. Social is human capital, and governance is financial capital, which is why you saw the image of the bank and the money, right? It's like, how are companies managing themselves and ensuring that the way they make money doesn't, you know, hurt people or societies. So this governance includes board diversity, executive pay, the audit structure, meaning how are companies doing checks and balances to make sure that they're staying within the lines. Shareholder democracy is all about enabling systems where shareholders have a voice, so they are owners, and how can they participate in helping an organization achieve their goals. Ethics and compliance, anti-corruption, lobbying, and IT security and cyber risk. Does anybody know anything about lobbying and why this would be on here? Companies spend a lot of money on making sure that their interests are preserved, that their interests are protected. And so many investors want to understand how much money they are spending in these efforts and who they're spending it with. And so investors often want to see the amounts of money and the associations that companies have for lobbying. And of course, IT and security risk is increasing more and more, right? Companies are at great risk protecting the data of all of their stakeholders, their customers, their employees, and also protecting the assets of the company and avoiding risk from, you know, what we hear in the news, which is, you know, people breaking into companies' information and even sequestering it, right? Through holding it hostage and wanting money for it. So these are the details around ESG. Questions or comments? Anything that you particularly is interesting or you have a question about?
Looks like there's a comment in the chat about including employee health and well-being under social.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree. And yeah, and you bring up a good point, that this list that is on the screen is not exhaustive, right? There's a lot more, and this gives you kind of a sense, but yes, social is
also
about
learning and development, upscaling, all of anything that's under, you know, governs employees and their well-being and advancement and safety. All of that is under social.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that was Yasmin, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. So that's a great way to put it, right? Everything around employees and keeping themselves safe. Anything else I've missed that you all have some ideas? Because I know that we do have some expertise out there. What else is missing on the lists?
Melissa Walker just wrote, you spoke about ESG being a focus for shareholders, but what are some of the other reasons companies need to focus on ESG?
What I love to say, because I am in the stakeholder business, so my job is director of stakeholder engagement, is think about all your stakeholders and what's important to them, right? So employees, communities, right? Another reason why would be your communities that we as businesses operate in. What's important to them, and making sure that we are helping them have better life experiences, and in the end they will give back to you, right? It's a virtuous cycle where we make things better for others and others bring the benefits back to us. So one way to think about it, not just the investors, but all of your stakeholders. And so I would tell you, whatever company you work for, one of the most important things to do in identifying how you can provide more benefits is to know who your stakeholders are. Have you listed them out? Do you understand what's important to the stakeholders? So what are some common stakeholders? Employees, communities, suppliers, right? Think about how companies engage with suppliers and provide them benefits to grow and enables them to give jobs to other people. So employees, suppliers, also governments. Many companies have to work with, whether it's your local government to federal and international governments. And lastly, another stakeholder could be the media and NGOs, who are organizations that your company may work with directly. So Melissa, that's a good question, right? Another reason to work on this is because it matters to your stakeholders. Let's see.
I also have another comment from Annie. She said most companies are focusing on the E side of ESG because it's measurable and easy to track. The S side, on the other hand, is a bit harder to track and report. That's
right. And the G is even harder, right? But on the S side, maybe we'll throw this out. What are some ways that you can track on the S side? Well, one way that I particularly know, because it's what I do with ShowMe50, is the percentage of diverse employees in your organization all the way to the top, right? It's one thing, number one, your workforce in general, but then who's leading your company and how diverse is it related to the representation of your communities and of your employee base and your customer base. What are some other ways we might measure the S part?
Annie put diversity on your board and leadership team.
Yep, that's a good one. Here's another one we may not think of. On the customer protection, you could look at, for example, number of recalls. We know that car companies have a lot of recalls, right? So you could say, well, hey, how many recalls does that company have? And could it be that they're not, they need to improve the safety around their products? And then on the governance side, some of the ways that we can measure, Annie, to your point on diversity of the board, you can certainly look at the annual filings of boards to see the composition of the board. They usually tell you the age of the board, so that you have, diversity of age. And of course, through the pictures, you can see the diversity in terms of ethnicity and things like that. Executive pay is another great way that you can measure, how does the company pay its executives versus how it pays the rest of its employee base. So the last study I saw showed that the CEOs on average of the S&P 500 are making about 350 plus times the pay of an average employee. Apple recently was in the news. Their CEO, Tim Cook, makes 1,400 times the average employee of their company.
Jose says, if we want to learn more, what options do we have?
If you want to learn more about ESG and sustainability, that's great. So let's see, I'll just flash on this, I'll show you in a minute. You'll get a copy of this presentation, but here are 3 web podcasts that I listen to that I think are fantastic. ESG Now, which is from MSCI. It's a 15 to 20 minute podcast. You've got ESG Insider from S&P Global, 15 to 30 minutes. And then GreenBiz runs a weekly 60-minute podcast. Those are 3 that I highly recommend. Also, if you want to specifically focus on environment, these are 2 books that I've read and I love. On the left is the Bill Gates book. And then the one on the right is very business oriented. It's got images, but it's a great environmental focused net zero book. Okay, so the last thing I want to leave you with is when you think about ESG, again, really this goes back to Melissa's question and Annie's question and conversations around, you know, looking at the whole thing holistically, is that think about as these 3 intersecting circles. You've got the environmental stuff, you've got social, you've got governance, and they all really intersect, right? I'm going to give you one specific example, which is something called environmental justice. Environmental justice is about when you are looking at the actions a company takes, you need to make sure that everyone is improving their well-being around air quality, for example. Let's say you're going around and planting trees. Well, if you only plant them in affluent areas, well, what about lower income areas? They need clean air, they need shade. Also, companies may decide to put their manufacturing facilities in the low rent areas and just creating more toxicity for lower income communities. So part of the combination of social and environmental is thinking about environmental justice. The most important thing I want you to remember is that it's at the intersection of the ES and the G where you can really achieve sustainability, when you are focused on the environmental responsibilities, social, and governance. And the United Nations, they're the ones that wrote the initial official sustainability definition back in 1987. And it's this, which is it's an enduring definition: meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so it's when companies are really balanced in the E, S, and the G that you are able to really achieve true sustainability. I thought we'd end with just a review of what we covered. And again, if you have questions, I would love to continue to answer any questions you have. So let's just do this. So what was the catalyst for ESG and what decade was that in? Annie just put a great thing on the chat there. Thank you. Okay, so what was the catalyst? The 70s. Yep, the 70s. And do you remember exactly what thing it was? The Vietnam War. Yes. Okay. Okay, what does ESG stand for? This one's easy, right? Environmental, social, and governance. Okay, now we're going to do some testing here. Name 2 topics that were in the environmental section of ESG. What are 2 things that are in environmental? One of them we talked about with the, yep, okay, carbon reduction. Thank you, Maddie. Biodiversity, yes. Lower and zero emissions. Hey, Lynn. Okay, great. Okay, 2 topics within social. We talked about quite a few of these. Yep, gender diversity, human rights. There was one I talked about that isn't as common. Yes, thank you, Sumia, customer protection. Okay, how about governance? A couple of topics on governance. Executive pay, board diversity. Yep. Super. Okay. And then Jaden, thank you, lobbying. Data security. Okay, what shape is often used to convey ESG and sustainability? What was that diagram of purpose I showed you? Yes, Venn diagram. And then where in that shape is sustainability achieved? There's a big target in the middle, right? At the intersection of all three. And then can anybody tell me some of the parts of the definition? I know it's kind of a long definition, but what's the United Nations definition of sustainability? Do you remember some of the words? It starts with meeting the needs Yeah, I like that, in your own words, right? Meeting your own needs without compromising the needs of future generations. The present, I love that, the present without compromising, right? It's kind of like the short term and the long term all in one. I'm going to put a link in the chat that is to the newsletter that I write around sustainability, and it comes out weekly on Mondays. So that's another way that you can, take a quick read. It's short, and every week you can add to your acumen around sustainability. And lastly, here's for you, right, to think about, where in ESG do you find your why? Where is it that you feel passionate, and how can you take that in your current work environment and help your own organization identify opportunities where you can connect with both your job responsibilities and with either the ES or G, right? I think that's what's powerful, is when you can take your employees and they begin to come up with ideas and innovations within their scope of work that also impact ES and G. Yeah, so that's it. Are there any remaining questions? We're, right at 12:42. I'll have this presentation posted on the ShowMe50 website, and you can share it. And then lastly, if you enjoyed this information and you found it useful and you want to make a small donation, you can do it at the ShowMe50 website through the donate button, or through Venmo. So I hope that you found this helpful, and that you will keep reading about ESG and finding ways to incorporate it into your daily work and in your communities. And that's really all I have. So if there's no other questions.
Thank you so much.